Hi, everybody. Welcome and thank you so much for joining us here tonight for the launch event for Saul Griffith's just out today new book, Electrify, an Optimist Playbook for Our Clean Energy Future. He's here in conversation with Laura Fraser and Sam Calisch. My name is Evan Karp. I'm the events manager for Booksmith. We're an independent bookstore and a mainstay of San Francisco's Haight-Ashbury district since 1976. Sam Calisch is a collaborator on the book, an MIT-trained engineer and scientist who leads research at Rewiring America. Also, he founded Elmworks, a startup making hardware for electrification. Excuse me. Laura Fraser is a journalist and author of 3 books of nonfiction, including the New York Times bestselling memoir, An Italian Affair. As founder and editorial director of She Books, she published 75 short ebooks by women before selling the company to She Writes Press. She lives around the corner from the Booksmith and has launched all 3 of her books with us. She's also interviewed several authors for the Booksmith. Lately, she's been collaborating with Saul Griffith and Rewiring America. So while she is not objective about the material in Saul's new book, she is well acquainted with it. Saul Griffith is an inventor, entrepreneur, and engineer. He's the founder of Rewiring America, which is a nonprofit dedicated to decarbonizing America by electrifying everything, and founder and chief scientist at Other Lab. He was a recipient of a MacArthur Genius Grant in 2007. We're thrilled to host tonight's event, which promises to be a fascinating conversation. I want to thank you all so much for being here. Again, please show some love for Sam, Laura, and Saul in the chat. And congratulations, guys, on the book. Thanks for joining us tonight.
Evan, thanks so much. I'm going to get started here asking some questions. And it is a little weird because I've been a journalist in the past, but I have collaborated on this book. We call the collaboration spew, mop, and polish. And it worked really well.
That meant I vomited the words and stared down the blank page.
And then I mopped up the vomit and turned it into rational thoughts.
And I polished it. And
into a story.
Yes.
A love story for humanity.
Yes. So one of the both advantages and disadvantages I had working on this project is that unlike these two, I don't have a PhD in physics. I didn't even take high school physics, which is a crime that should never happen to anyone. But I was able to sort of like get the layperson's understanding of what's going on in this story about climate change. So I guess the first thing that I want to ask you, Saul, is given the just dreadful news that we have about the climate, the obvious impacts of climate change, wildfires, hurricanes, on and on and on. The subtitle of your book is An Optimist's Playbook for Our Clean Energy Future. What is the basis for your optimism, both scientifically and, spiritually?
Now is probably the worst time to admit that I actually argued with the editor a little bit about putting optimism in the subtitle. However, I don't regret that she prevailed and optimism is in the subtitle, so I'm now owning it. And I think the case for pessimism is strong. We are behind schedule on decarbonising for a 1.5 or even a 2-degree world. In fact, built into our projections from the IPCC and the trajectories by which we might succeed here in decarbonising, we sort of made accounting cheats about 20 years ago that we're now paying for. So the world allowed, the IPCC allowed the modelers to model in a lot of negative emissions. Some negative emissions is possible and desirable, but we're now banking on enormous amounts that may not be practical. So that's another case of pessimism. You still look around the world politically, and at federal government level around the world, the ambitions are not matched by the reality. So it was fabulous news when the Biden administration came out, 50% reductions by 2030. That was wonderful. I had 24 hours of pure joy over that announcement. But now I've been engaged with the actual process of trying to write those ambitions into legislation, you realize that in the US, like everywhere in the world, governments are hampered by realpolitik in terms of what they can legislate for. And so we're not so far tracking to hit those targets by the legislation that's being passed. And, that's not to single out America or Australia is the same, et cetera, et cetera. So now I have you not terribly optimistic. Where does the optimism come from? So I have the good fortune of doing work on lobbying for electrification and doing analytical work on how we go through this energy transition for some European countries, and then quite deeply engaged with the US and with the Australian versions of this. And what you can see is that at the state level, so at the subnational level around the world, you could cherry pick pieces of the legislation and the regulation and the policy making required where you can see that is the right success story. One version of this is when I'm in the US, I tell them the perfect country would be Australian rooftop solar policy, Norwegian electric vehicle policy, maybe California electric vehicle policy, and Japanese or South Korean heat pump policy, which roughly covers the way we make our electricity in the two dominant ways that we use it, which is, or will be using in the future, which is driving our vehicles and heating our water and our space in our buildings. So you can find the right pieces of regulation happening in, for example, Norway, Tasmania, Victoria, California, New York. And so my optimism is there. My other optimism is that in reality, the engineers and the scientists have done a tremendous job over the last 5 decades, because we've really been in one rolling energy crisis since the first energy crisis in 1973, the oil crisis. And we've now created unbelievably low-cost solar energy, unbelievably low-cost wind energy. Batteries are cheap and getting much, much, much cheaper. Electric vehicles are, right now, it's hard to find someone who has bought an electric vehicle that doesn't prefer it from everything they've ever owned before. That wasn't true 5 or 10 years ago, nor was the story about the solar true. And the reality is that all of those technologies are getting cheaper and better just in time. Well, you might, for some people, it's 1 or 2 decades late, but it's at least in time that you can imagine that if the world motivates, we could install and replace the existing stock of vehicles, the existing building heating systems, and the way we generate our electricity to in fact achieve a world somewhere between 1.5 and 2 degrees.
So you've talked about how in order for us to achieve that goal of staying below 1.5 to 2 degrees, we need what's called a 100% adoption rate of clean energy technology. And that's sort of your whole message, is that we need to electrify everything. So what does that mean? Does that mean that I need to sort of take the car that I'm driving now and get rid of it? Does it mean, that the next thing I buy has to be electric? Like what does it mean in reality for us as, normal people going about our daily lives to have, the rate of adoption of electrified
things
powered by renewable energy sources?
I think the question is fabulous. I didn't set out to write another academic treatise on climate change or energy. I really wanted to write the Burn This Book, the field manual for climate success for activists. I feel like there aren't enough technical voices that are ready to get behind the children who have the right sense of urgency, and I particularly intone the children led by Greta around the world in promoting very fast action on climate change. And I think we need to. So I was trying to write a very broad public audience book that was sort of the game plan and the support for on the ground activists of any age, really, that are trying to make this happen in time. And so the Electrify everything, really there should be a tiny bracketed almost between electrify and everything, because there are a few things we will do without electrification. But it was about clear and simple messaging. And then around the transition, there's one chapter in the book that introduces a relatively recent concept in climate science, which is committed emissions. So committed emissions are the emissions that a machine that exists today will emit in the rest of its natural life. So if you bought a petrol-powered car last year, or a gasoline car, it will, sorry, I'm currently living on 2 continents, it seems, so I have to translate between petrol and gasoline every day. But if you purchase a gasoline car last year, it will emit for 20 years because most cars survive 20 years. If you bought a natural gas peaker plant as PG&E last year, it will probably exist for 30 or 40 more years. If you built a coal plant in China, it will live for 40 or 50. But you may have bought a water heater last year or a few years ago, and it will last about 10 years. So all of those machines will emit those committed emissions. And the estimate is if all of the machines in the world live out their natural life, we hit 1.8 degrees.
Wow.
So that means that that's why you hear people advocate for let's retire coal early. That's a great idea, but retiring coal early still only brings us into maybe 1.7, 1.6. That's the heaviest emitter protocol. So really, if you think about it, it's going to be hard for people to, give up the car they bought last year. What you really want to focus on is making sure that when Sam buys his next car, or when my, I have a 50-year-old Land Rover, when it dies, I either electrify it or buy a new electric vehicle. And when your water heater dies, we would like to make sure that the industrial capacity is there, the installation labor, so the contractors or the tradies who do that job are able to do that job. And we really need, as soon as possible, as a society, as a civilization, as communities, as people, to be able to make sure that we make the clean, zero carbon choice for all of these machines on the demand side that we own. That's the cars and the heaters and the kitchen appliances, as well as on the supply side, heavily scaling up wind, solar, probably some nuclear, definitely some hydro, and so that we can meet the supply and demand.
So this is something that I think is really different about your argument from others that I've heard, in the climate realm, which is instead of focusing on the supply side of, how are we going to be powering our lives, you're really focusing on the demand side, which is what are the machines that we use every single day. And I mean, I think one thing that's interesting to me is it feels like that puts a lot more power in it gives all of us a lot more power. It's like, instead of sort of saying, okay, we have to wait for the governments out there to change how power is delivered to us in our homes, it's saying, no, we can start basically shifting the kind of power that we need by shifting the kinds of appliances that we have, by changing our hot water heaters to heat pumps, by changing our gas-powered cars to EVs.
So I think that came from probably the letdown experience that everyone finished at the first Al Gore movie, which was a good movie, and I don't wish to criticize it. But it was like, at the end of the movie, it's like, what can you do tomorrow? And the list was like, don't use plastic drinking straws, buy stainless steel water bottles, LED light bulbs.
Write your congressman.
Write to your congressman. You should still write to your congressman. That was a good suggestion. But it wasn't even nearly substantive enough to address the actual problem. And I think that power comes from information and from simple stories and from elucidating the solution in enough detail that people can see their own role in the solution and their own participation. And so I think, and so one of the things Sam and I did last year, and this was one of the ways he was critical in helping get the book out, was reorganize the greenhouse gas emissions that the US government publishes, which is normally organized in big abstract sectors like agriculture, industrial, commercial, transportation. But it really then hides the fact of who it is, who's to blame for it, or who's responsible, or what machines are causing it. So we rearranged all of that data and then showed that, about 42% of those emissions are decisions that we as voters, householders, family people make around our kitchen table.
So
And then
you're saying that 42% of all of our emissions come from our households and our cars.
from the cars that are owned by, there's 128 million households in the US, and 42% of emissions are caused by the choices they make about what fuel goes in their car, what fuel goes in their furnace, what fuel goes in their hot water, what they use to cook their food, and whether they have natural gas in drying their clothes or whether they use sunlight or electricity. And so it's even more if you then take small businesses as another example of where the rubber hits the road. So it's about another 20-25%. So the majority of our emissions, we actually have agency and control in on the demand side in these machines. And Sam and I even went to the ridiculous extent of enumerating all of those machines in the US economy. And there's, around 500 million machines that run on fossil fuels today that we need to replace out if we wish to have a similar looking lifestyle 20 years from now, in roughly 20 years, which, definitely sounds heroic, but the optimism comes from, at least we now know the problem, we can name it, we can name and shame the machines in our own homes and our lives, and we can think about them as the infrastructure of the 21st century. So whereas 20th century it was coal plants and big dams and projects like the Hoover Dam, now infrastructure, I think we need to understand we have huge agency in and we own and control part of. And so, the book does do a lot of work on that demand side, but it also talks about where we're going to get all the energy on the supply side to feed all of those machines.
Right. And critically, that 500 million machines, these are things we're going to replace anyway. And so kind of the action comes in terms of preparing and pledging not to spend another dollar on fossil fuels, to when your water heater breaks, get the electric heat pump version.
And that's, sorry.
Oh, that's a critical point.
Yeah.
No, I think Sam.
Yeah.
This is exactly how Sam would mop. I would make grandiose statements, and Sam would be like, but actually, to make it more clear, I think this, we don't want people to suffer the, deer in the headlights. Oh my God, you've told me I have to replace everything tomorrow in my life. But everyone who's on this call lives in a home, has a small business or works in an office where in the next 20 years, you will be buying a new vehicle anyway. You will be buying new water heaters anyway. You will be changing out the furnace in the basement. And what we need to focus on, this is the last moment in history where we can achieve that 1.5 to 2 degree climate target by replacing every machine as it retires, which is a better version of the story than if we have to go in and rip them out and take them away from people.
And so, Sam, you were talking about a pledge, and I know that rewiringamerica.org, which Saul co-founded and which we all work for, actually has a pledge online at rewiringamerica.org that you can sign and say, and I have a bumper sticker that says, this is my last gas-powered car. So that's really the bottom line, is that the next time you replace something, be it a car, be it a stove, be it a hot water heater, anything that's powered by fossil fuels, your backyard barbecue, you have to replace it with something that's electric.
Yeah, and it's hard. The easy thing is when you have a cold shower, you replace like for like. That's the fastest option. But if you plan for it and prepare for it, get yourself ready.
So what do you have to do to plan? So if your water heater goes out tomorrow, and right now we're just talking about people who are homeowners, because that's renters is another issue that we'll get to. But if it goes out tomorrow, I don't know if is your house ready for a heat pump? Can you just plug it in, or do you have to plan ahead and you get a better breaker box or something?
So how I interpret that question is, how well prepared as a society are we to make this possible? And right now we're a long way off. But actually enumerating machines forces you to think literally about the entire wiring diagram of whole nations in the whole world. So it makes you have to think from the appliance through the house, out through the 180 million utility poles that connect to the 5 million transmission line poles that connect to the giant hydro and solar facilities. It forces that question. And then you start to think about, well, okay, if a nation or the world is going to sign up to actually achieve these climate targets, where are we failing? And one is, as Sam said, if we already know that most water heaters fail, and the family who it fails on is under financial duress, or the partner is pregnant, or it's the middle of winter, and you don't really want to wait 6 weeks for the trained person for the boutique heat pump replacement to come along, because you would like to have a hot shower tomorrow. And so we haven't yet built up the workforce that's trained to do the job. We haven't yet built up the manufacturing capacity. So the good news is roughly half of new heating systems in the US are heat pump and electric, but the other half are natural gas. So we still need to increase the manufacturing capacity. With cars, it's worse. Only 10% of US vehicles are manufactured are electric. We need to get that to 100%. And then we need to make sure that other things are true, to bring up another difficult problem.
The cost.
The cost. So
because all of these machines have high upfront costs. So anyone who's looking at like, how am I going to electrify my house, is looking at like $70,000 to replace, if they were to replace all of these machines at once and put solar on their roofs, etc. So how do you deal with these really high upfront costs? I mean, down the road, when you have your solar panels on and you're using your heat pump, your energy bills are going to be way lower. But it's just that, upfront cost. How do you deal with that?
To open up how we brought this up in the book. So, after we wrote the book, but a little bit before the book, Sam and I actually studied how much does the average American household have to save after electrification, and it would be $2,500 a year, which is meaningful, impactful, because the average American household only spends about $65,000 a year. So it's a substantial fraction of what they spend. But the problem then is, you've probably heard the headlines, 40% of American homes only have $400 or something in case of emergency. So when the water heater or the furnace breaks or the car breaks down, how do you make sure that's electric? And we're going to need a whole bunch of regulations and policies to enable that. And a lot of them are around finance. So how do you pay for things that are expensive up front but last a long time? And then the book, where we intone, hopefully we weave as much interesting history as you can into a non-fiction book on electricity and energy. But I think we need to actually start to think heroically about all of these issues. And the heroic precedent here is Roosevelt, as a response to unemployment during the Great Depression, invented Fannie Mae and the modern 20-25-year mortgage, which was essentially the US government declaring that the suburbs will now be infrastructure, and we will qualify them for very special infrastructure grade low interest financing. And that created the largest capital pool in the world before and since. It still is the American housing outlook huge.
Even though some people were left out of that opportunity.
It wasn't perfectly executed, as most policies weren't, and African Americans were excluded, and it was troublesome. So hopefully we are now aware enough that we should be better about designing these systems. But we need to think about, how do you finance every home on this journey of electrification and decarbonization? Because if we don't, it will become the cultural divisive issue. And so I think really the concreteness of thinking through 100% transformation of the economy really forces you to start to have to answer, how do you do it for a single mother in Ohio? How do you do it for a low-income community in Texas? Not just how do you take people on the Silicon Valley Tesla journey through electrification, because it should be obvious, but we don't get to zero emissions if only 50% of households can afford it. So it was actually thinking through those issues in the book that very much made us start rewiring America to start shaping policy and suggesting policy that could help do that transition.
And it's important to point out these high upfront costs are not a permanent state of being. I mean, we're already seeing this with electric vehicles, where nearly all predictions say electric vehicles are going to be cheaper than an equivalent internal combustion engine before 2025. And if you would have asked me that 2 years ago, I would have not predicted anything close. And so the same is going to come true for heat pump water heaters. The costs are coming down. The pool for which the financing works out to weigh the upfront costs against the long-term operational expenses savings is going to grow. We just need to stimulate the market and catalyze the change.
Because then you get scale.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
So
you got to get scale.
Do you drive an electric car?
I do, yeah.
How is it?
Chevy Bolt, I love it.
Yeah. Is it
you know,
like faster? Does it have better pickup? What do you like about it?
Oh, it's just everything's easy. It's like, it's like driving my computer.
So the laughter here is a little bit because I went to live in Australia for 9 months last year, and I loaned Sam my electric Chevy Bolt. And when I say my, I mean my wife and I, our leased Chevy Bolt. And through the misadventures of international currency transfer, the Chevy Bolt got repossessed twice. So while Sam's fuel costs plummeted and the cost of driving was practically zero for him,
You didn't factor that in.
Yeah, I didn't factor in those costs.
The cost of repossession was high. But back to Sam's point on scale. So there's also a chapter in the book which I think is extremely important. And while we were writing the book, because it took six or more months, and even since then, the pace at which these changes are happening and the cost reductions are incredible. But we grossly captured the historical trend in the book. And with every doubling in the production number of something, the cost drops by some amount, and that's called the learning curve. So every time we double the production quantity of solar, the cost is reduced by about 20%. Turns out that 20% is roughly true also for the other critical technologies of wind, of batteries, and electric vehicles. The amazing, here's one case for optimism, is that we need about 16 times as many solar panels as there are now. We need about 12 times as much wind. We need more than 10 times as many electric vehicles, and we need something like 16 times as many batteries. So each one of these things is doubling 1, 2, or 3 or 4 times, and you get that 20% reduction. So just by virtue of the planet signing up to solve this problem and electrify, we are going to reduce the cost by more than half of all of the critical technologies. And if you actually take the rate at which all of these industries have been growing, if we just continue that rate of growth, we would actually be able to supply all of the world's transportation, all of the world's power by 2035 or 2036. So we won't actually keep accelerating. We're on the upswing of that S-curve. So it'll probably flatten out. Probably shouldn't use S-curve anyway. So we're currently growing really fast. We'll slow down a little, but I do think there is optimism to know that we are growing at a rate that could get us there by the middle of the next decade.
So for a long time, it seems to me the narrative about environmentalism and about climate change has been one of efficiency and deprivation. Sort of in the 70s, when we first all became aware of environmental problems, it's like turn down your thermostat, Jimmy Carter's saying wear a cardigan, and it's all about being more efficient and doing without. And the small daily things that people think of doing, are like, well, I have to, shiver, I have to eat less meat, it's all deprivation. And it seems to me that that's one of the reasons why, a lot of people are very opposed to even the idea of climate change, because it means that they would become less comfortable. And so what you're sort of proposing is a different narrative about how you can fight climate change.
Yeah, and I'm sure I haven't heard the backlash yet, but I'm sure it's coming. There will be some environmentalist backlash. But I think you accurately gave the broad brushstrokes. To fill in a tiny bit of detail on the history. 1970, we had Earth Day, the largest mobilization of environmentalists really before or since. And they were sort of looking for something to attach their passion to that went beyond the sort of silent spring protests around environmental toxins. And then the oil crisis of 1973 landed on Nixon's desk. And because that was a supply side crisis, we were missing 15% of the oil that would normally have come from the Middle East. And so when the brains trust was gathered to solve that problem in the 70s, the answer was policies that still exist today. CAFE, the corporate average fuel economy standards, to make cars 15% more efficient, and Energy Star appliances to make our appliances 15% more efficient, because that in theory was enough to lower our solve that supply side crisis. That we had a brief period with small cars in America in the 1980s, but then once the crisis was over, we went back to big cars. But however, that narrative of shrink things, make them colder, turn the thermostat down, absolutely continues to exist, and it is culturally divisive. The interesting thing about electrification is there was another collaborator on the book, in a sense, Keith Pascoe is not here, and he and I did a project with the Department of Energy where we mapped all of the energy flows in the US, and then we imagined what happens when you electrify all of those energy flows. And it turns out that the efficiency we were always looking for with those things was electrification itself. It really means that you would only need less than half of the energy that the US economy uses today if we electrified all of the end users. That's how much better or efficient the electric machines are.
That's because you're losing half your energy just like digging it up and transporting it and distributing it and burning it.
I think the origins of that are interesting. There's some people. Yeah, some people. Well, hopefully I have a few hundred of those people watching this talk. There's even the accounting errors. There's an accounting error in the way we collate the data of the Department of Energy that means about 7 or 8% of the energy we think we use in the US doesn't even exist. It was an accounting error made to allow us to talk about hydroelectricity in the same terms that we talked about oil or coal.
I had to rewrite this paragraph 7 times before it was clear.
Anyway, for complicated reasons. But there's another.
We were better for it.
There's another reason for optimism. 7% of the energy you think we need, we don't need, just because of an accounting error written into the way we do the numbers. Another 10% of the energy in the US is using oil and natural gas and coal to find more oil, natural gas, and coal. So a lot of that gets transformed out of the system. And then then the actual structural machine efficiencies are much, much higher. So an electric vehicle traveling the same number of miles as a petrol, gasoline, or diesel equivalent uses less than 1/3 of the energy. A heat pump water heater uses 1/3 of the energy of a natural gas water heater. And then one of the biggest wastes in the US energy economy is the way we create electricity. It's nearly all what they call thermoelectric, which means you use heat to boil water, to run a generator, to run a turbine, to run a generator to create electricity. Our coal plants run typically at around 30% efficiency, and our natural gas plants run at 40 to 50. So the average efficiency of the US electricity generating fleet today is about 38%. When you create electricity with solar, and the rest is wasted as heat. The other 72 or 62% is what goes up the smokestack as waste heat. When you create electricity with solar or with wind, you don't generate any of that waste heat. So it's also, you get 3 times more for the same amount of effort because you're not wasting it. So they're the reasons that the electrification is the efficiency we always wanted, and you can squint and pretend that you don't have to shrink homes, and you don't have to shrink our cars, and we can have everything that we currently have, which is true. And then in the last chapter, we caution that while true, that we could have everything we have today, we should also, if we're going to do this transformation in a grand effort to save the planet that we love, we might hopefully entangle some of the other environmental issues and solve them as well.
So maybe just buy less stuff, eat less meat, all of those things are helpful.
All of those other things are helpful, but let's get ourselves a long way down the electrification journey, and we don't have to have those culture fights yet.
So it's a lot more useful for me to electrify my car in terms of the impact on the planet than it is to stop eating meat.
I think that is true for most people, but not all. I think you have to go into details of your meat eating, and I'm not sure we want to prosecute that case live for the audience here.
There's a nice phrase for this: electrification is the entree like all of these other things are nice desserts and side dishes and lovely things, but you can't have them without doing clean electrification.
Yeah,
Great way to put it.
this policy conversation is actually reasonably advanced in Australia in a way, or more so than it is here, that the understanding that the things that we can do this decade, we have to understand fixing climate is really a 3-decade problem. But the things that we can do this decade that already exist, that are already working, are these demand side machines that we mentioned, which are your cars, the way you heat your home, generating with solar and wind. The book also goes into the other things that are major contributors to climate change, that include meat, that include steel, that include cement. And we're making progress as a species on all of those things. We have alternative meats now. There is work in Australia using seaweed that prevents the cows from burping, that makes the meat much greener. I kid you not. And there is hope on the horizon, but you can't, with those solutions for those last 30% of emissions, there's not something on the table that exists today that I can point you at that's working that shows you that for sure we've got it. So I think if we were really sensible about how we prioritize solving climate, we wouldn't use the traditional framing of industry, commercial sector, residential sector, transportation. We would prioritize like things we can do now, things that we are on track to do later, and things we don't know how to do yet. And the 70% of the things we need to do now, the whole world needs to be going full tilt at. And then that hopefully buys us enough time to figure out steel, figure out cement, figure out aluminum, figure out meat.
Long haul aviation.
Figure out long haul aviation. But again, there are green shoots in all of these. But let's prioritize what, to buy ourselves the most time downstream. We need to make the most progress we can in the shortest time possible this decade.
So in about 2 weeks, the COP26 conference is happening in Glasgow, where all the world leaders are getting together to sort of renew their vows about climate goals and so forth. What are you looking for, hoping for, expecting out of that conference?
Okay, do you want the optimism or the pessimism? Do you want me to start with what I'm expecting, or do you want me to begin with what I'm hoping for? Let's address the 800-pound gorilla made out of carbon dioxide. No country is legislating sufficiently to meet the commitments they're going to have to make to pretend that we're on target for 1.5 or 2 degrees. And I don't know how narratively the world leaders are going to resolve this problem in time. It may end up being the thing that kills this particular conference.
I thought you were going to say species.
Well, it could. So I think it's going to be very interesting how the commitments measure up to the realities. I do think that what everyone is experiencing now is ambition is enabling more ambition, and progress is enabling more progress. And so worst case, everyone signs up for net zero 2050, which is weak, and it's really a sort of 2-ish degree or 2+ degree kind of target. But at least they've then set themselves on their journey. And I think that gives me some optimism, because I think that raw economics, the fact that this is now an economic transition to do in Australia, the fact that we're a small number of years away for most households in the US, this being a slam dunk, but it's already possible for components in most houses and completely in some houses. So that there's some optimism that even if we just get directionally right with the commitments from governments, technology and progress will fill in the middle. So I expect to be disappointed about the comparison of the commitments versus the reality of the policy. What would I be super excited about? So that's maybe what am I optimistic for? I think there is an enormous opportunity for a new Churchill to emerge at this conference. What do you think? Churchill to me was amazing because, having a terrible defeat at Dunkirk, he was then able to motivate a completely demoralized nation with a speech that roughly said, we're completely screwed. But the only thing we can do is fight, and we will fight them on the beaches and we will fight them in the air. And it was, under terrible circumstances, motivated people to believe that the fight alone was noble and worth fighting, and therefore we should do it. So I think there is an opportunity for, I think in all of the nations of the world, we're now governed by a poll. So the level of ambition that Joe Biden can have or Scott Morrison can have is sort of restrained by this governing by polling. But the opportunity is for one of these leaders or one of the other world leaders to stand up and say, and to be much more honest with us all and say, no one knows how to do this yet, but the fight is noble and we all have to do it. And I would like that, honestly. I think if America did it, that would be the most profound thing of all. Or if China did it, I think that's less likely. I think Biden wants to be known for giving his best on this, so perhaps it could come from there. I think that, very ironically, given Australia's history of terrible behaviour at the COP conferences, in fact, causing some of the bad accounting methods, it would be most profound if the Australian Prime Minister, right now he's pretending like he's not going to go, which is not good, but if he actually went, he could stand up and believably say, the economics have transformed in Australia first, and that's because we have low population density, we have the best solar, and we figured out the regulatory hack and the financial hack to make this solar so cheap. And then he would say, so this decade, we will lead, and we will show you the way. We'll solve the little problems and how all of that technology integrates together. And then next decade, Australia will help the world with, because they'll be able to create excess renewables. There's a small number of countries that have enough renewables that they'll make an excess. And Australia could then help the rest of the world with green steel and green aluminum and green cement. You would love that to, let's say Scotty Morrison gets up and says that first. And then Joe Biden says, that is fantastic, and we have our long and trusted ally, and we will stand behind them, and we will apply our industry, and we will commit to an effort analogous to the arsenal of democracy, which was Roosevelt's commitment of American industry to produce the materials to win the war in World War II. And if Biden, the perfect scenario is something like that, and which enables world leaders to truly own up to how difficult this is going to be and how much of a transformation it is going to be. And that's what we need if this is not going to disappoint the children.
So thank you. With that,
sorry, did I monologue?
No. I just noticed that we have a lot of questions about Electrify. So Evan, do you want to chime in with a few questions that you have for?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you guys all. And thank you, everybody who's asked questions. We'll do our best to get to them. There are a lot. So I'll start off, I think, with Jill has a question. It seems to me that Fannie Mae type financing approaches are still debt-based. I know we've talked about this a little bit. That excludes renters and those otherwise unable or unwilling to take out a loan, roughly 50% of the United States population. What type of financing will we use for the other 50%? Have you heard of inclusive utility investment such as pay as you save? What do you think the role of utility investment in electrification will be? And Carol adds to that also recoverable grants for seed funds, similar to revolve financing for community solar. Thank you, guys.
I think this is one of the most critical questions that we can ask ourselves, and it's a fantastic question. We announced the solution that probably fits the most people, just because ownership, single home ownership is 60 or 70% in the country that we wrote this book for, which is the US, and there are financial instruments that can help. But that's, you know, we don't get to 100% reduction without helping every family come along. So there are some very encouraging programs. The DOE is running one, and you mentioned it, where you can, you know, the utility pays the upfront cost for the electric appliance, and then as you pay with your bills, you end up paying that off, and then the household owns the hardware or the infrastructure once they finish paying it off, which I think is a really good model because you put the ownership with the household. There is, remember that a lot of this, we need to figure out mechanisms to pass this through landlords. So a lot of the landlords would qualify for the type of financing that we mentioned through Fannie Mae. So that covers a little more ground. The question really is, and I'm not sure, and I think this is something that I hope brighter economic minds than me address, but like, how do we pass on the savings that the landlord will realize to the household? That's a really interesting question. And I know that, you know, since we wrote the book, Sam and I, working with Rewrite America, have been heavily engaged with various members of the US Senate. And, you know, I think half of your year, Sam, has been spent modeling how do you design rebates, how do you design things, because, you know, as a first port of call, rebates to help with the upfront costs, then tax incentives. How do we use every single possible regulatory lever? You probably might want to chime in.
I would love it if all of you would write to your congressperson and say that we need point of sale direct rebates for residential electrification as well as tax credits. Those two work in concert with each other, because the lower portions of the income brackets aren't able to take advantage of tax credits. That's where the rebates get targeted. Tax credits are more politically feasible. They can help the slightly higher income brackets, and then the financing tools layering on top of that. So,
and even though it's insufficient, we want to support the Zero Emissions Home Act that's part of the infrastructure bill.
Absolutely. We've been channeling lots and lots of effort into a bill through Senator Heinrich in New Mexico to do exactly this: direct point of sale rebates for low and moderate income households. Please, if you can, write to your congressperson and demand that this remain in the Build Back Better infrastructure bill.
All of the there's a sort of a cleanup chapter in the book called Yes and ... which was meant to be very generously say, you know, yes, and we need all of the ideas. And I think it's been very clear to Sam and I in modeling that there's going to be these savings, because curiously, energy has the capacity to get cheaper because of the technology developments. Who gets to realize the benefit of those savings? Is it going to be the household? Is it going to be the bank that finances it? Is it going to be the utilities, which traditionally have a stranglehold on this? Or is it going to be third parties?
Jeff Bezos,
Sunrun, Tesla. And I think as a nation and as a world, if we were trying to have a North Star or a principle of how we try to divide up those successes, I'd like to maximize the benefit that goes to households. You will have to have a little bit everywhere, because everyone's going to have to be able to have incentives aligned to make it. But if we have too many rent seekers in how we divide up this pie, it won't be as fair a transition as it needs to be. So I think this question gets directly to what environmental justice and an equitable transition looks like.
Thank you, and thank you for the question. The next question is from Yashas, who is wondering, what can renters do to electrify their homes?
Good question, because here in San Francisco, 65% of us are renters, and I've asked this question myself: what can I do?
We're not there with perfect answers to this question yet. So I actually think globally we need to do a mea culpa. Like, no one has all of the answers. Yes, and we need more solutions. Part of the renting problem is a lot of those renters also don't have garages. How do you charge an electric vehicle if you don't have a garage? There's statistics. You know, I'm writing this book, you'll see there's lots of graphs and charts and numbers. It's filled my head with a dizzying array of numbers, including that only 40% of American vehicles go to sleep at night within 20 feet of an electrical outlet. So if we're going to do wholesale fleet electrification, that's going to be a challenge akin to the rental one. But what do renters do? Well, talk to your landlord, talk to them about the economics of this transition. I think that's, right now there isn't a much better answer than that. Some of the technologies that help with this transition, renters will be able to take with them. This is increasingly happening with appliances like air conditioners, water heaters, that will actually become something that you remove when you go to a new house. That will certainly be true of electric vehicles for renters. But we tried to be comprehensive with answers, but we don't. The book, it was difficult to get an answer for everything, and I still think there's genuinely interesting questions around this.
And to add to that, a number of the policy proposals under consideration have provisions in them that try to make sure that benefits both give a little treat to the landlord, but also flow through to the renters, such that everyone sees the benefit of electrification.
Thank you, guys. And thanks for the question, Yashas. The next one comes from Dee, who's wondering, and Dee is an architect, wondering, will the grid be reliable and substantial enough to electrify everything? Dee has trouble convincing clients to go all electric.
So I think we're still at the uncomfortable period. Does everyone remember when we had like 18-bit modems and it made the crazy noise when you had to dial up? Yeah, exactly. Currently, the electrification of your household experience sounds like, and everyone's worried about grid security, et cetera, et cetera. So can the grid do it? The answer is yes. Can today's grid do it? The answer is no.
We're going to need 3 times as much electricity, right?
Yeah. So America today uses a number called 3.5 terawatts of energy. If you only about half of a terawatt is electricity, only about 1/7 delivered electricity, we will need about 1.5 to 2 terawatts, so about of 3 or 4 times as much electricity if we electrify everything at the same size, maybe only 2 to 3 if we use other more traditional efficiency measures. Because of the way we designed the grid, this is super technical and nerdy, but because of the way we designed the grid 50 years ago around health and safety issues, there's a huge amount of excess capacity in the distribution line. So we can probably squeeze enough electricity over the lines locally. We will need more transmission to hook up to more solar and wind rurally, but the electricity over the local lines, that they have enough capacity. The problem is we designed the grid to only let the electricity go one way. Now we want the electricity to be able to go back. There is some technology challenges there. There's some regulatory problems there. A battery at the house so that you don't have to feed it back. You can just keep it for yourself is the technology solution that's backed by companies like LG, Tesla. I think there will be, except those batteries right now are very, very expensive. They will be cheap enough to make that a very good idea in about 3 years' time.
And we want to share electricity with our neighbors too, right? You've talked about like grid neutrality. That's sort of like the internet, where we have like packets of electricity that we can, share wherever it's needed.
Yeah, I think to solve this problem of motivating everyone in the right direction, we need to, as a guiding principle, again, have grid neutrality, which intones net neutrality. Net neutrality is the idea that no one's email has higher priority than anyone else's. It should be the same with electricity. If you have a small solar on your roof, you should be treated with the same value as a giant utility scale generator. I think we need to make those rules. We need to enable those rules. We need the batteries to get cheaper. And then we need a lot of the regulations that make the installations difficult and the technologies, nobody has really made it easy to turn on an electric house. In fact, we are today dialing in from an all-electric house that I finished this year, and it's hard to turn it on because nobody has made the software layer that makes the experience easy. So I think to your architect self, work with your technology friends, and we need to all be part of the solution in making this an easier experience. We're just not quite there yet, which is the tragedy, because we've got to get an awful lot of the way there this decade to hit our climate targets.
But I mean, it's scary to think about increasing the amount of delivered electricity by 3 or 4 times, but we've done it before. In the 50s, we doubled the amount of delivered electricity in the US, and in the 60s, we did it again. So we quadrupled the amount of delivered electricity, and that was driven by demand.
And that's the exact schedule we need to do it
Right.
this time around. Two decades to triple or quadruple.
Yeah.
Beautiful. Thank you, guys. And thank you, Dee, for the question. Next comes from Scott, who says, we know how to do it, electrify almost everything we can with carbon-free power while we continue to innovate our way out of the more challenging decarbonizing cement, steel, long flights, et cetera. But how can we get the political and media machine to get on board and stop getting in the way?
Revolution.
I really do think it is time. I think the children are the only people with their heads screwed on, and they're going on strike, and they're trying to foment the revolution, and we should be getting behind them and joining that revolution. So that's the reality if we want to make it happen very quickly. I think stepping back from that, we don't yet have a single country in the world where an obvious political plurality is asking government to make this happen on the schedule required. And I think that's limiting the ambition of the Biden administration. It's limiting the ambition everywhere because we haven't got a political movement in the center. And I say that I think this can't come from the far left, can't come from, pure far right. There will be, 5 years from now, the conservative economic theorists will say, well, the free market won and showed us that renewable energy was the cheapest, having spent 30 years saying the opposite. But that will happen at some point. So you could imagine it coming from both sides. But I actually think we need to build a political movement in the center that advocates for these things. And just to say that I think that's really becoming possible.
Hasn't Murdoch flipped?
I was about to say just this week, and I have it's really interesting because I work on this issue on 3 continents, so in Europe, in Australia, and in the US. And in the last week, the Murdoch press has, in Australia, not in America,
It's a test balloon.
The Murdoch press has said, well, climate change is real and Australians will save money and it'll be an economic miracle to solve climate change and we should do it. So think about that that's the same Murdoch press that owns Fox News in the US. I strongly believe that is a test market and test messaging for how they will roll that messaging out in the US later. I think they know, like we know because we studied the economics of it, that Australia, it works first, so they've got more, it's more believable because in some parts of Australia, 50% of homes have solar on their roof and they've already realised that they're paying lower bills. So I think it's that big political movement. We need to be close enough on the economics that everyone can see a solution that's not going to really hurt their day-to-day life. And then I think we can have that giant political movement. We need to be ready to organize that movement so they can get rid of the regulations that are in the way so that they can train the people required to do all of this installation. This is a huge number of a huge amount of work in every country to achieve this. And so we're not there yet, but I can see the tide is shifting, and I think it's momentous to think that a news agency like Fox Murdoch has just flipped their messaging.
Wonderful. Thank you guys. I want to just check in real quick since we're at the hour. We have more questions. Are you guys okay to take another question or two? Or
sure.
Yeah.
Beautiful. Thank you. And thank you all so much for your questions. We won't get to them all, but perhaps we can try to figure out a way to coordinate any further question answering. Certainly, I'm sure most of your questions are answered in the book itself. But let me go here to Jordan, who is wondering for Saul and Sam. I'm a first-year PhD student at Carnegie Mellon and a huge fan of the work you and Rewiring America have done. What advice do you have for new researchers in the area of residential decarbonization, electrification, specifically in environmental justice communities?
Well, sign up to do an internship with Rewiring America next summer. We'd love to have you. Is the easy answer. Solve
the renter problem with technology hacks.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of technology that can be applied to, in creative ways, put batteries in different places, change the way these devices can communicate to the grid and do demand response, use the savings that can be enabled by that to buy down the upfront cost of these things. I think those are all technology solutions you can do. I think there's still technology work needed in the balancing of how this all goes together. So the control systems, the communications protocols for the grid, these are fantastic PhD topics that I hope you and a few thousand of your peers take on. I think understand that there's a temptation in academia. I consider myself a recent graduate, even though it's 20 years ago, but I don't think academia can sit on the sidelines and be completely apolitical. I also think you need to, in the course of your work, advocate for the right changes and get involved on the front lines, as well as doing the impartial academic work.
Thank you. And we've got one more question here, which is from Andrew. What's that?
And write to your senator.
Write to your senators. Andrew's wondering, can you outline how Electrify is different from the Rewiring America book? And please feel free to tell us more about that if you'd like.
We were trying to influence American politics and decision makers while we were writing the book. And MIT Press was generous enough to allow us to release about half of the book, probably with a lot of typos, as the Rewiring America handbook. There's about twice as many chapters. There's a little more content in all of them in the book. The very broad outline is the same, but if you would like to win all of the dinner party table debates, there's way more humorous anecdotes in the full-length version.
And a really snazzy blue lightning bolt.
Thank you, guys. Get that lightning. Saul, congratulations on the book. Laura and Sam, thank you so much for being here and leading the conversation. Thank you all so much for joining us. If you don't have the book, you can get signed copies from Booksmith. The link is just beneath the video. I should have said, it might say out of stock. We're shipping it straight from the warehouse to your house, or to the shop if you want to pick it up in San Francisco. So do click through and get the book. Get your signed copies now. Guys, thank you again for being here and congratulations on the book.
And check out rewiringamerica.org.
Same thing.
Your next stop, everybody. Have a good night and take care.
Thanks, everyone.